Hello! Welcome to our channel. Today we have an inspiring story full of life lessons to share. If you enjoy meaningful content, leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion means a lot to us. Let's get started with this touching narrative.
Elderly mother is scorned by her rich son, but the end of this story will move you. The gentle hum of a Vespa echoed through the cobblestone streets of Bellagio, a jewel of a town perched on the edge of Lake Como. Tourists wandered along narrow alleyways lined with colorful houses and terracotta rooftops. Bougainvillea draped itself over balconies, and the scent of freshly baked focaccia lingered in the air. Atop a modest hill overlooking the lake sat an unassuming stone house, weathered with time but brimming with character. Rosa Bellini, a 72-year-old widow, lived there alone. The shutters were freshly painted a cheerful green, and a small garden thrived under her care. Lavender, rosemary, and a single olive tree stood as a testament to her perseverance and love for life's simple pleasures. Every morning, Rosa would rise at dawn. The sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the worn wooden floors. She started her day with a cup of espresso, its aroma filling the cozy kitchen. The walls were adorned with faded family photos, each frame telling a story of a life once bustling with love and laughter. In the center of the mantelpiece was a photo of a young boy with mischievous eyes and a wide grin. Lorenzo, her only son, now a man of wealth and prestige living in bustling Milan, was her greatest joy and her greatest sorrow. After finishing her coffee, Rosa wrapped a light shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside to tend to her garden. The gentle breeze carried whispers from the lake, and she hummed an old Italian tune as she pruned the lavender. To the casual observer, Rosa seemed content, but her eyes carried a sadness that only those who truly knew her could see. Rosa was kneeling in the dirt, carefully planting new flowers, when she heard the distant rumble of an engine. Shielding her eyes from the sun, she saw a sleek black car making its way up the narrow road to her house. Her heart skipped a beat. As the car came to a stop, the driver's door opened, and out stepped Lorenzo. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, his shoes polished to perfection. His sunglasses reflected the glint of the sun, hiding his eyes. Rosa's hands trembled slightly as she rose to her feet, wiping the dirt from her palms onto her apron. "Lorenzo," she said, her voice warm but cautious. "What a surprise." "Ciao, Mama," Lorenzo replied, leaning in to kiss her cheek. It was brief, almost perfunctory. Rosa's heart swelled with love despite the formality of his gesture. "You should have told me you were coming. I would have prepared something." "I'm not staying long," Lorenzo said, his tone clipped. "I have meetings in Milan this evening. I thought I'd stop by on my way." Her face faltered for a moment before she recovered with a soft smile. "It's wonderful to see you, even if only for a little while." She motioned for him to come inside, and Lorenzo followed, his gaze briefly scanning the modest home. The kitchen smelled of fresh herbs, and a loaf of bread rested on the counter, still warm from the oven. "How are you, Mama?" Lorenzo asked, sitting at the small wooden table. His voice lacked warmth, as though the question was more out of obligation than genuine interest. "I'm well, caro," Rosa replied, setting a plate of biscotti and a small espresso in front of him. "And you? How is life in Milan?" Lorenzo removed his sunglasses, revealing sharp eyes that seemed perpetually preoccupied. "Busy as always. Business is growing. I just closed a deal with an international firm. It's demanding but rewarding." Rosa nodded, her pride mingling with a pang of sadness. "You've done so well for yourself, Lorenzo. Your father would be proud." Lorenzo's expression tightened briefly at the mention of his father, but he said nothing. He glanced at his watch, tapping it lightly. I actually wanted to talk to you about something, Lorenzo said, breaking the silence. Rosa's heart fluttered with anticipation. Could this be the moment her son would invite her to spend more time with him in Milan? I've been thinking, Lorenzo began. It might be better if you came to Milan for a while. You shouldn't be alone out here in Bellagio. Rosa's eyes widened. You want me to come to Milan? Yes, Lorenzo said, leaning back in his chair. I have a spare room in my apartment. It's more practical. You won't have to worry about maintaining this house. And you'll be closer to me. Rosa's lips parted in disbelief. For years, she had longed to feel included in Lorenzo's life again. And now he was offering her a chance. Lorenzo, she said, her voice trembling slightly, are you sure? I wouldn't want to impose. It's not an imposition, Lorenzo replied briskly. Just makes sense. I'll send someone to help you pack your things next week. Rosa hesitated, her joy tinged with unease. Lorenzo's tone lacked the warmth she had hoped for, but she chose to focus on the opportunity to be closer to her son. Grazie, Lorenzo, she said, smiling softly. The following week, Rosa stood on the steps of her home, her suitcases packed and ready. Neighbors came to bid her farewell, their kind words mingling with their skepticism about Lorenzo's intentions. You'll be back soon, Rosa, said Signora Francesca, her closest friend. You belong here, not in Milan. Rosa hugged her friend tightly. We'll see, Francesca. Perhaps this is a chance for Lorenzo and me to reconnect. As the black car pulled up to take her to Milan, Rosa turned to wave one last time at the little house on the hill. Her heart ached, but hope bloomed within her. The drive to Milan was long but smooth, the lush greenery of Bellagio giving way to the bustling energy of the city. Lorenzo's apartment was a stark contrast to Rosa's home. It was modern, with sleek furniture, marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. This is your room, Lorenzo said, showing her to a small but well-appointed guest bedroom. Rosa placed her suitcase on the bed, her hands lingering on the handle. Thank you, Lorenzo. It's lovely. I won't be home much, Lorenzo added. But you'll have everything you need here. Rosa nodded, masking her disappointment. She had envisioned shared meals, conversations, and laughter. Instead, she felt like an afterthought in her son's grand life. Over the following days, Rosa found herself alone in the apartment more often than not. Lorenzo left early in the morning and returned late at night, if at all. She tried to keep herself busy, tidying the already spotless rooms and cooking meals that often went uneaten. One evening, Rosa sat by the window, gazing out at the city lights. Her reflection in the glass looked small and out of place in the grandeur surrounding her. A tear slipped down her cheek as she whispered to herself, perhaps Francesca was right. I don't belong here. As the days turned into weeks, Rosa began to notice patterns in Lorenzo's behavior. His avoidance of her, his preoccupation with his work, and his unwillingness to engage in meaningful conversation. One night, as she placed a steaming plate of pasta on the dining table, she finally asked, Lorenzo, why did you bring me here? Lorenzo hesitated, his fork hovering over the plate. I thought it would be better for you, he said, his tone dismissive. Better for me or better for you? Rosa asked softly, her gaze piercing but gentle. Lorenzo didn't answer, and the silence between them spoke louder than words. The morning in Milan began with the same sterile efficiency that had characterized Rosa's days since her arrival. The sun filtered through the towering glass windows of Lorenzo's apartment, casting long, sharp lines of light on the pristine marble floors. Rosa sat quietly at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. The room was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of traffic far below. Lorenzo had left early again, his briefcase in hand and a hurried, distracted, "I'll see you tonight," thrown over his shoulder as he exited. Rosa had barely been able to respond before the door clicked shut, leaving her alone once more in the cavernous apartment. She looked at the empty plate across from her, where she had carefully set out his breakfast earlier that morning: a warm brioche, slices of prosciutto, and a small dish of fresh berries. It remained untouched, like so many other meals she had prepared for him. With a quiet sigh, she rose, cleared the table, and returned the food to the refrigerator. Her days had become a blur of solitude and routine. She cleaned the already spotless apartment, ran small errands to the market, and took walks through the crowded streets of Milan, where she felt like a ghost amidst the rushing tide of strangers. Even the little pleasures she once treasured, like cooking or tending to plants, felt hollow without someone to share them with. One afternoon, she decided to venture into Lorenzo's study. The room was sleek and impersonal, dominated by a wide desk and shelves lined with books and awards. Rosa's fingers brushed against a photo frame on the desk, its surface glossy and cold. It was a picture of Lorenzo at a business gala, surrounded by smiling colleagues. His arm draped around the shoulders of a glamorous woman in a sequined dress. Rosa's eyes lingered on the image. Her son looked every bit the successful businessman, confident, polished, untouchable. But the eyes she saw in the photo were not the ones she remembered from his childhood. Back then, those eyes had been full of curiosity and mischief. She could still recall the way they lit up when he brought her a wildflower from the hillside, or when they shared gelato on summer evenings by the lake. Where had that boy gone? And when had the distance between them become so vast? As she set the frame back down, her gaze fell on a stack of unopened letters tucked into the corner of the desk. Rosa hesitated, her fingers hovering over the envelopes. The top one bore her name in Lorenzo's careful handwriting. Curious, she picked it up and slid her finger along the edge to open it. Inside was a letter dated years ago. The words were raw, filled with uncertainty and a tinge of guilt. Lorenzo had written about his struggles with the expectations of success, his fears of failure, and his longing to make her proud. Rosa's heart ached as she read the letter. It was a glimpse into her son's inner world, a world he had closed off from her long ago. The sound of the front door opening startled her, and she quickly folded the letter back into its envelope, returning it to the stack. Lorenzo entered, his expression tense. "Mama, what are you doing in here?" he asked, his tone sharper than she expected. "I was just," Rosa began, unsure how to explain herself. She gestured toward the desk. "I was looking at your photos. It's a beautiful picture of you." Lorenzo sighed and loosened his tie, dropping his briefcase onto a chair. "You don't need to tidy up in here. It's fine as it is." "I wasn't tidying," Rosa said softly, her voice steady but sad. "I was trying to learn more about you." Lorenzo froze, his hand mid-motion as he reached for a glass of water. He looked at her, a flicker of something unspoken passing through his eyes. "There's nothing to learn," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now. "I'm the same as always." "No, Lorenzo," Rosa replied, her voice firm but gentle. "You're not. And I wonder if even you know who you've become." Her words hung in the air, heavy and full of truth. Lorenzo looked away, unable to meet her gaze. The days that followed were strained. Lorenzo buried himself in his work, leaving early and returning late, as though avoiding Rosa's presence would somehow quiet the unease she had stirred within him. Rosa, meanwhile, continued to move through her routines, though her heart felt heavier with each passing day. One evening, after yet another silent dinner, Rosa gathered her courage. She placed her fork down and looked across the table at her son, who was scrolling through emails on his phone. "Lorenzo," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Do you remember the summers by the lake when you were little?" Lorenzo glanced up, his brow furrowed. "Course, Mama. Why?" "You used to say that the lake was magic," Rosa continued, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You said it made you feel alive, like anything was possible. Do you still feel that way?" Lorenzo set his phone down, the question catching him off guard. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. Rosa leaned forward, her gaze steady. "Do you remember the last time you felt alive, Lorenzo? Truly alive?" Lorenzo opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He sat back in his chair, his expression conflicted. Rosa reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Caro mio," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Life is not measured by the deals you close or the wealth you accumulate. It's measured by the love you give and the connections you nurture. Don't let yourself forget that." Lorenzo's eyes filled with something Rosa hadn't seen in years: vulnerability. For the first time, she saw a crack in the armor he had so carefully constructed. "I don't know how to fix it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Rosa squeezed his hand gently, her smile warm despite the tears in her eyes. "You start by trying, Lorenzo. And you start with me." The conversation marked a turning point, though subtle and tentative. Over the next few days, Lorenzo made an effort to spend more time with Rosa. He joined her for morning coffee, asked her about her walks in the city, and even listened as she shared stories from her youth. For Rosa, these small moments felt like rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds. But deep down, she knew the path to truly reconnecting with her son would not be an easy one. And though Lorenzo was taking his first steps toward healing, the shadow of pride and the weight of his past still lingered heavily over him. The tension between Lorenzo and Rosa continued to linger, a fragile thread of connection that neither fully knew how to mend. While Lorenzo showed small efforts to bridge the distance, his deeply ingrained habits of avoidance and pride often overshadowed them. Rosa, ever patient, tried to focus on the moments of kindness, no matter how fleeting, holding on to the hope that her son's heart would eventually soften. One particularly gray morning, the clouds over Milan mirrored Rosa's growing unease. Lorenzo had promised to join her for a walk through the city, a small but significant gesture she had eagerly anticipated. Rosa waited by the door, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, glancing at the clock every few minutes. As the hours passed and Lorenzo failed to appear, her optimism began to wane. By early afternoon, it was clear that he wasn't coming. Rosa sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping under the weight of disappointment. She slipped off her shawl and placed it back on the hook by the door, retreating to the small guest room that had become her sanctuary. Lorenzo didn't return home until late that evening. Rosa heard the familiar click of the door as he entered, the sound of his leather shoes echoing on the marble floor. She stepped into the hallway, her expression calm but her eyes searching. "You didn't come," she said softly. Lorenzo froze, briefly closing his eyes before turning to face her. "I'm sorry, Mama. Something came up at work. You know how it is." Rosa nodded slowly, her lips pressed together. "Yes, Lorenzo. I know how it is. But do you?" Her words were gentle, but they struck a chord in Lorenzo. He looked at her, his usual mask of indifference slipping ever so slightly. "You promised me," Rosa continued. "I waited all morning. And when you didn't come, I realized that perhaps you don't see me. Not really. To you I am just here." Lorenzo's jaw tightened. "That's not true, Mama. You're exaggerating." Rosa stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "Am I? Lorenzo, when was the last time you asked me how I felt? When was the last time you sat with me, not out of obligation, but because you wanted to?" Lorenzo opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The silence between them grew heavier, until Rosa finally shook her head and stepped back. "Perhaps I was wrong to come here," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I thought this was a chance for us to rebuild what we've lost. But I see now that you're not ready for that." Her words lingered long after she had retreated to her room, leaving Lorenzo alone in the dimly lit hallway. The following morning, Rosa awoke early. She packed her small suitcase with quiet determination, her movements steady and deliberate. Though her heart ached, she knew she could no longer stay in a place where she felt invisible. When Lorenzo finally emerged from his room, still groggy and adjusting his tie, he found Rosa standing by the door, her suitcase at her feet. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice tinged with alarm. "Home," Rosa replied simply. Lorenzo blinked, confused. "Mama, what are you talking about? You can't just leave. I can, Rosa said firmly. And I will. Bellagio is my home, Lorenzo. It is where I am loved, where I am seen. Here, I am a shadow in your life. And I will not live that way. Her words cut through Lorenzo like a blade, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of her disappointment. Mama, please, he said, stepping closer. I know I've been distracted, but things will get better. Just give me more time. Rosa looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. Lorenzo, I have given you time. Years of it. And I will always love you, mio figlio. But love is not enough when it is not returned. Before Lorenzo could respond, Rosa picked up her suitcase and opened the door. The cool morning air rushed in, carrying with it the faint sounds of the bustling city. Lorenzo stood frozen as Rosa stepped out into the hallway, her figure retreating into the elevator. The doors closed with a quiet ding, leaving him alone in the silence of his empty apartment. The train ride back to Bellagio was both a relief and a heartbreak for Rosa. As the cityscape of Milan faded into the distance, replaced by the lush hills and sparkling waters of Lake Como, she felt a sense of peace returning to her. Yet her thoughts lingered on Lorenzo, the boy she had once known and the man he had become. When she arrived in Bellagio, the familiar warmth of the town greeted her like an old friend. Neighbors rushed to welcome her back, their smiles and embraces filling the void Lorenzo had left. Rosa, we missed you, said Signora Francesca, taking her hand. It wasn't the same without you. It's good to be home, Rosa replied, her voice soft but steady. She returned to her little house on the hill, the sight of its green shutters and blooming lavender bringing tears to her eyes. As she stepped inside, the familiar scent of her home wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. That evening, Rosa sat by the window, watching the sun set over the lake. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, the water shimmering like a sea of molten gold. She held a cup of tea in her hands, the warmth seeping into her palms as she reflected on her journey. Despite the pain of leaving Lorenzo, Rosa felt a renewed sense of strength. She had made a choice to prioritize her own dignity and happiness, a choice she knew was necessary, even if it meant letting go of the dream of reconciliation. But what Rosa didn't know was that her decision had set something in motion. Far away in Milan, Lorenzo sat alone in his apartment, staring at the letter he had written to his mother years ago. The words, now yellowed with time, seemed to echo back at him. Mama, I want you to be proud of me. But sometimes I feel like I've lost my way. The emptiness of his apartment pressed down on him, a stark reminder of the void Rosa had left behind. For the first time in years, Lorenzo allowed himself to feel the weight of his actions, and the fear that he had driven away the one person who had always stood by him. As the city lights flickered outside his window, Lorenzo made a decision of his own. It was time to go home. Lorenzo sat in his silent apartment, the weight of Rosa's departure pressing on him like a stone. He had never imagined a day when his mother would choose to walk away from him. In his mind, she had always been the constant, a gentle, patient presence who endured his coldness without protest. But her absence now felt like an open wound, and he couldn't escape the truth. He had driven her away. The letter in his hands trembled as he read the final line once more. You are my heart, Lorenzo, no matter what. The words, written in his mother's careful hand, pierced him in a way nothing else had. Rosa had given him her heart, and he had taken it for granted. Lorenzo rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. He couldn't stay in this sterile apartment another moment. He needed to see her, to tell her the words he had held back for so long. The drive from Milan to Bellagio was one Lorenzo had taken countless times, but this time it felt different. The gleaming black car that had once symbolized his success now felt like a cage. As he navigated the winding roads toward the lake, the sights he had once dismissed as mundane took on new meaning. The rolling hills, dotted with olive trees, seemed to whisper stories of resilience and history. The sparkling waters of Lake Como stretched endlessly, their beauty as timeless as the village he was approaching. Lorenzo tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his mind racing with memories of his childhood. He remembered summer afternoons spent by the lake, where Rosa had taught him to skip stones. He could still hear her laughter, soft and musical, as he celebrated his first successful skip. Back then, her joy had been his anchor, her love a compass that guided him. When had he lost sight of that? Rosa, meanwhile, was settling back into her life in Bellagio. The small house on the hill once again hummed with life. She spent her mornings in the garden, her afternoons visiting neighbors, and her evenings by the window, watching the sun sink into the horizon. Though her heart ached for Lorenzo, she reminded herself that she had made the right choice. She had given him everything she could, and now it was up to him to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. That afternoon, as she stood in her kitchen kneading dough for a fresh loaf of bread, a sound caught her attention: the low rumble of an engine, growing louder as it climbed the hill. Rosa wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, her heart quickening. The sleek black car came to a stop in front of her house, and the driver's door opened. Lorenzo stepped out, his suit jacket discarded and his tie loosened. He looked different, less polished, more vulnerable. "Mama," he said, his voice breaking slightly. Rosa stood still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. "Lorenzo," she replied, her tone neutral but her eyes searching his face. The walk from the car to the front steps felt like miles for Lorenzo. He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I needed to see you," he said. "I needed to apologize." Rosa tilted her head slightly, her expression softening. "Apologize?" "Yes," Lorenzo said, his voice firmer now. "I've been selfish. Blind. I've taken you for granted, and I see that now. When you left, it was like the world tilted off its axis." Rosa's heart clenched at his words, but she remained composed. "Why did you come, Lorenzo? What is it that you want from me?" "I want your forgiveness," he said, stepping closer. "But more than that, I want to make things right. I've been lost, Mama. I thought success and wealth would fill the emptiness, but it hasn't. It never could." Rosa studied him for a long moment, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Then finally she spoke. "Lorenzo, I have already forgiven you. I have always forgiven you. But forgiveness doesn't erase the pain." "I know," Lorenzo said quickly. "And I don't expect it to. But I want to change. I want to be better. For you and for me." Rosa nodded slowly, her composure breaking as a single tear slipped down her cheek. "Then come inside, figlio mio. Let's start with a cup of coffee." The familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen as they sat at the small wooden table. Lorenzo looked around, the simplicity of the space suddenly feeling like a sanctuary. "I missed this," he admitted, running his fingers along the edge of the table. "I missed you." Rosa smiled faintly, though her eyes were still cautious. "And I missed you, Lorenzo. Every day." As they sipped their coffee, the conversation flowed hesitantly at first, then more freely. Lorenzo spoke of his struggles in Milan, the pressure, the loneliness, the hollow victories that had once felt so important. Rosa listened, her heart breaking for the boy she had raised and the man he had become. "You've carried so much," she said softly. "But you don't have to carry it alone, Lorenzo. Not anymore." Lorenzo looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and something else, hope. That evening, they walked together down to the lake, the setting sun painting the water with shades of gold and pink. Lorenzo carried a basket of fresh bread and olive oil that Rosa had packed, and they sat together on a weathered wooden bench by the shore. For the first time in years, Lorenzo felt at peace. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of lavender from Rosa's garden. "Mama," he said, breaking the silence, "I want to spend more time here. I want to be part of this place again." Rosa smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Then you are always welcome, caro mio. Bellagio has room for you, if you have room for it in your heart." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Lorenzo reached over and took Rosa's hand. It was small and weathered, but it was strong, just like her. "I'll come back," he promised. Not just for you but for me. This is where I need to be. Rosa squeezed his hand gently, her smile widening. Then you've found your way home, Lorenzo. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, and for the first time in years, both mother and son felt whole. The days following Lorenzo's return to Bellagio were filled with cautious hope. For Rosa, having her son by her side again felt like a fragile dream. She watched him move through the small, familiar spaces of her home with a mix of hesitance and curiosity, as though he were rediscovering a piece of himself he had long forgotten. For Lorenzo, every moment in Bellagio seemed to peel back a layer of the person he had become in Milan. The simplicity of life in Bellagio had a rhythm of its own, unhurried, authentic, and rich in moments of quiet connection. Lorenzo found himself drawn to these small details: the warmth of the morning sun on the hills, the sound of children laughing as they played in the piazza, and the aroma of bread baking in his mother's oven. On a crisp morning, Lorenzo stood at the edge of Rosa's garden, watching her prune the lavender bushes. Her movements were deliberate and patient, as if she were coaxing life back into the plants with her touch. "Can I help?" Lorenzo asked, surprising even himself with the question. Rosa paused, looking up at him with a faint smile. "You want to help in the garden?" He nodded. "Why not? It's been a long time since I've done anything like this." Rosa handed him a pair of gardening shears, her smile widening. "Then start with the rosemary. It needs trimming." Lorenzo knelt beside the bush, his suit jacket and tie replaced by a simple shirt and trousers. The scent of rosemary filled the air as he carefully snipped away the overgrown branches. Rosa watched him from the corner of her eye, her heart swelling with quiet pride. For hours they worked side by side, sharing stories and laughter. Lorenzo told her about his first business deal, a small investment that had set the foundation for his career. Rosa, in turn, shared memories of her youth, painting vivid pictures of the Bellagio she had known as a girl. It was the first time in years that they had spoken so openly, and both mother and son felt the weight of unspoken words beginning to lift. As the days passed, Lorenzo began to engage more with the village. He walked through the cobblestone streets, stopping at the small market to buy fresh produce and chatting with the locals. At first, the villagers regarded him with cautious curiosity. This polished man from Milan seemed out of place in their humble town. But as they saw him helping Rosa carry baskets of fruit or repairing a broken chair on her porch, their opinions began to shift. Lorenzo wasn't just visiting. He was becoming part of the community. One afternoon, Lorenzo found himself sitting at a cafe in the piazza, sipping espresso as the bells of the local church chimed. Across the square, he noticed a group of older men playing bocce, their animated gestures and laughter drawing his attention. "You should join them," Rosa said, appearing beside him with a small basket of figs. Lorenzo chuckled, shaking his head. "I haven't played bocce since I was a kid. I'd probably embarrass myself." "Then it's time to practice," Rosa replied with a wink. To his own surprise, Lorenzo accepted her challenge. The older men welcomed him with good-natured teasing, quickly showing him the ropes. By the end of the afternoon, Lorenzo was laughing along with them, the game reminding him of the carefree days of his youth. In the evenings, Lorenzo and Rosa would sit together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the hills. It became their ritual, a time for reflection and conversation. One evening, as the sky turned shades of gold and pink, Lorenzo turned to his mother. "Mama," he began, his voice quieter than usual. "Do you think I can ever truly make up for the way I treated you?" Rosa looked at him, her eyes soft with understanding. "Lorenzo, love isn't about keeping score. You hurt me, yes, but what matters is that you've chosen to change. That choice is what heals wounds, not words but actions." He nodded, her words sinking deep into his heart. "I want to do better, not just for you but for myself. I want to be the man you always believed I could be." Rosa smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "Then you already are, Lorenzo. One step at a time." Lorenzo's transformation wasn't without its challenges. The pull of his life in Milan still lingered, with emails and phone calls demanding his attention. One evening, as he sat on Rosa's porch scrolling through his phone, a call from his business partner came through. "We need you back in Milan," the voice on the other end said. "There's a deal in the works that requires your presence. It's important." Lorenzo hesitated, his gaze drifting toward Rosa, who was inside baking a tart. "I'll think about it," he replied, ending the call. That night, he lay awake, torn between the demands of his career and the newfound peace he had discovered in Bellagio. For years, he had measured his worth by his success in business, but now he wondered if there was another way. A life where he could balance ambition with connection. The next morning, Lorenzo approached Rosa with a decision. "Mama," he said, his voice steady, "I need to return to Milan for a few days. But I promise you this isn't goodbye. I'll come back." Rosa looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Are you sure, Lorenzo? Bellagio will always welcome you, but you must decide what kind of life you want to live." He nodded. "I'm sure. I need to tie up loose ends there. But Bellagio? This is where I want to be." Rosa smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Then go, caro mio. Do what you need to do. And when you return, we'll be waiting for you." As Lorenzo drove away from Bellagio, the rolling hills and shimmering lake reflected in his rearview mirror. He felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known in years. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was the beginning of something new. And for Rosa, watching her son leave this time didn't bring sadness, but hope. She had seen the seeds of change take root in Lorenzo's heart, and she knew that when he returned, he would bring with him not just his presence, but the love and respect she had always deserved. The soft hum of the train from Milan echoed through the valley as it approached Bellagio. Lorenzo sat by the window, his reflection superimposed over the picturesque hills and sparkling waters of Lake Como. His return to Milan had been brief but transformative. For the first time in years, he had approached his work with a new perspective, no longer consumed by ambition but driven by the desire to create balance. As the train slowed, the familiar charm of Bellagio came into view, the cobblestone streets winding through the village, the terracotta rooftops glowing in the afternoon sun. Lorenzo's heart swelled with anticipation. This time, his arrival was not out of guilt or obligation. He was coming home. Rosa stood at the top of the hill, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. She had spent the morning preparing, baking fresh bread, setting the table, and ensuring the house was filled with warmth. But it wasn't just the house that was ready. Her heart, too, had prepared itself to welcome her son back, not as the man he once was, but as the man he was becoming. When Lorenzo's car pulled up, Rosa stepped outside, her face lighting up with a smile. Lorenzo emerged, carrying a small suitcase in one hand and a bouquet of wildflowers in the other. "Ciao, Mama," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Ciao, Lorenzo," Rosa replied, her smile widening. They embraced tightly, the weight of their past falling away like autumn leaves. The evening was perfect. The table was set under the olive tree in the garden, the soft glow of lanterns casting a golden light. Rosa's freshly baked bread, olive oil, and a platter of roasted vegetables filled the air with an irresistible aroma. Lorenzo had brought a bottle of wine from Milan, and they toasted to new beginnings. As they ate, their conversation flowed effortlessly. Lorenzo shared stories from his time in Milan, but unlike before, he spoke with humility and gratitude. Rosa, in turn, told him about the small joys of life in Bellagio, the neighbors, the garden, and the simple pleasures that made each day meaningful. "Mama," Lorenzo said, setting his glass down, "there's something I want to share with you." Rosa tilted her head, curious. "What is it, caro mio?" "I've decided to split my time between Milan and Bellagio," he said, his voice firm. "I want to keep working, but I also want to be here, with you, with this place that feels like home." Rosa's eyes glistened with tears. "Oh, Lorenzo, that's all I've ever wanted. For you to find your place, your balance." Lorenzo reached across the table and took her hand. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mama. You've always been my anchor, even when I didn't realize it. I owe you everything." Rosa smiled, her tears spilling over. "You don't owe me anything, Lorenzo. You are my son, and my love for you has always been enough." The bond between them, once fractured, now felt unbreakable. In the weeks that followed, Lorenzo began to integrate into life in Bellagio. He worked remotely from Rosa's home, often taking breaks to join her in the garden or for a walk along the lake. He attended community events, played bocce in the piazza, and even helped organize a local fundraiser. The villagers, who had once viewed him with skepticism, now embraced him as one of their own. Lorenzo's transformation was evident to everyone who met him, but perhaps most of all to himself. One evening, as they sat by the lake watching the sunset, Lorenzo turned to Rosa. "Mama," he said softly, "do you think Papa would be proud of me?" Rosa's eyes filled with love. "Oh, Lorenzo, he would be more than proud. He would be overjoyed. Because you found your way back. To yourself, to your family, and to what truly matters." Lorenzo smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The lake shimmered under the fading light, a reflection of the peace he had finally found. The final scene of their journey unfolded in Rosa's garden, where friends and neighbors gathered for a festive meal. Laughter and conversation filled the air, the table laden with dishes lovingly prepared by Rosa and Lorenzo. As the evening drew to a close, Lorenzo stood, raising his glass. "To Bellagio," he said, his voice strong. "To family, to love, and to second chances. Thank you, Mama, for showing me the way." The crowd erupted in cheers, their glasses clinking together. Rosa looked at her son, her heart brimming with pride and gratitude. In that moment, beneath the twinkling lights of the garden and the starry sky above, it was clear that their story had come full circle. The mother who had never given up on her son, and the son who had finally found his way home, were together again, stronger than ever. We hope this heartfelt story of love, forgiveness, and second chances inspired you as much as it did us. Rosa and Lorenzo's journey reminds us all of the power of family and the courage it takes to change. Let us know in the comments. What part of this story touched your heart the most? Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Your support helps us create even better content. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. Arrivederci, and see you in the next story.